Good evening and welcome to Festival of the Arts Boca, and thank you for allowing us into your home this evening for this, our third and final Authors and Ideas event of the festival. We do still have two more events coming up. This Saturday is our Festival All-Stars concert. Some of South Florida's finest will join music director Constantine Katsopoulos for a concert from the Addison in Boca Raton. And then on Sunday evening, we have the great jazz flautist Nestor Torres, who performed live at the Boca Raton Resort and Club. And so please do tune in for both of those events. All of our events are free this year, but they do still cost money to produce. So if you enjoy what you're seeing and believe in what we're doing, please do make a donation. You can do so one of two ways. Go to our website, festivalboca.org/donate, or send a text 41444 and write Boca 21. You can make your donation there as well. I do want to say a big thank you to, first I want to let you know that we did have an incorrect link to YouTube on our home page. So if you tried before and you ended up in the private room with us, please do try again. It is the correct link now. I do want to say a big thank you to tonight's sponsor, Baptist Health, and we now have a message from them.
To protect my patients, my family, and my community.
Because it's an act of kindness to those around me.
Because I love my family, my friends, and my community. I wear my mask, and so should you.
So join us. Let's wear our masks.
Hi, welcome. I'm Cynthia Brown, and this is Joanna Said is the last night of the Authors and Ideas series. And tonight, our moderator will be John Thomason, who's the managing editor of Boca Magazine. And before I turn it over to you, I just wanted to say a word about why we wanted Sonia Shah here tonight. I tend to have the television on sometimes when I'm working in the background. And I noticed that a couple of times I turned around because somebody caught my attention, and it was Sonia Shah. And then after turning around when she was on Fareed Zakaria, I thought, maybe I better read these books. And so I did, and I am delighted that she's here tonight. And now John will be our moderator and introduce her. Take it away, John.
Very much, Cynthia, and thanks to everyone who's tuning in at home to the final night of the Authors and Ideas portion of Festival of the Arts Boca 2021. It's my pleasure to welcome our guest for the evening, Sonia Shah. Sonia is an investigative journalist and author of critically acclaimed books on science, human rights, and international politics. Her latest book, The Next Great Migration, The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move, has been described as illuminating and masterful. I've read it. I agree with those. Sonia was born in New York City to Indian immigrants. As a child, she frequently traveled between the northeastern United States, where her parents practiced medicine, to Mumbai and Bangalore, India, where her extended working class family lived. This led her to develop a lifelong interest in inequality between and within society. Sonia is also the author of the increasingly relevant Pandemic, Tracking Contagions from Cholera to Ebola and Beyond, which was a finalist for the 2017 LA Times Book Prize, the New York Public Library's Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism, and the National Association of Science Writers Science and Society Award. Sonia holds a BA in journalism, philosophy, and neuroscience. Now, before we give the floor to Sonia, if you have any questions for Sonia at any point during her presentation this evening, we encourage you to type them into the YouTube chat or the Facebook Live comments section, because I will be using them to moderate the Q&A with Sonia in about 45 minutes time. Until then, take it away, Sonia.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for inviting me here tonight. I guess I'll start with just telling you a little bit about how I came to write at least my last two books. I've been writing about science, human rights, and health, politics, sort of the intersections of all of these things for about 20 years now. And I started writing my second to last book, Pandemic, which came out in 2016. I started that in 2010. So this is sort of, when the idea of a pandemic was sort of a fanciful speculation. Of course, the whole reason I could spend 4 years of my life reporting and researching and writing about pandemics is because a lot was known even then. So we're standing right now, today I think is the 1 year anniversary from when the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic. So we've been through this traumatic experience for a whole year now. And I have to say, we're in a better place than I would have predicted based on the history and what I'd known and been writing about for all those years before we had this pandemic. What I've seen in other pandemics is that we struggle for a long time, and we often in the past have only gotten rid of them by mistake. And it seems like this time we're in a slightly better place, even though we've had such a horrible experience. And so I just want to sort of observe that, the fact that we have a vaccine that works for this pathogen is really amazing to me. I've written about malaria and cholera and TB and Ebola and all these other scourges, which, you take something like malaria, still infects hundreds of thousands of people every year. Tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands some years die of malaria. And this is a disease that we have known how to prevent and how to cure for centuries. And yet we still have this huge burden of disease from old pathogens that we just haven't dealt with yet. And cholera too, we still have cholera. We still have a lot of cholera in this world. We have a pandemic of cholera that's going on right now, just a few hundred miles off the coast of Florida in Haiti. They've only just recently started to get that pathogen under control after many years. So the fact that we are turning a corner in the COVID-19 pandemic, I think is wonderful news for all of us, and something that we should really be thankful for. And I know I am, and I'm sure many of you are too. So what I wanted to do in my pandemic book, and the pandemic book really led to the migration book, and I can talk a little bit about that. But in the pandemic book, I wanted to, it was in a moment when it just really seemed like there was all these new pathogens coming up. My son had gotten methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, otherwise known as MRSA. And this is a highly antibiotic-resistant form of bacterial infection, a staph infection. And he was limping around for a while, and then when we kind of poo-pooed it, and then we finally kind of looked at underneath the Band-Aid on his knee, and it was he had just had these mountains of boils that were seeping, and we thought, wow, this is, that's kind of scary. So we took him to the doctor and was rarely shocked to find that there was nothing that really could be done. This was some new pathogen, and no one really knew what to do about it. So we were giving antibiotics, and then when that didn't work, we were giving other antibiotics, and when that didn't work, a third one. They were lanced. They kept coming back. Nobody knew why. He was told to take baths and bleach and all kinds of things. We couldn't control the pathogen either. It kept spreading in our family, even taking all the precautions. And I had grown up as the daughter of 2 doctors. And so I had really grown up with the idea that, well, infections is something that you can easily take care of, right? Modern medicine knows how to deal with infectious diseases. You just take some antibiotics or you get a shot. It's very simple. And yet here was this pathogen that was in my family that we just couldn't get rid of, and no doctor had any answers. So it really felt like something had changed. This is at the same time there was an outbreak of cholera in Haiti in the Western Hemisphere. The first time it had been in the Western Hemisphere in hundreds of years in the wake of the earthquake in Haiti. And so bird flu had come out. There was just like all these little pathogens and my ears were pricking up like, what's going on here? So I started kind of looking into this issue of emerging diseases. And, there had been a bunch of books about like different diseases and how they pop up and they cause all this damage and chaos and disruption and death. And then there's some heroic scientists and doctors who sleuth it all out and come up with a solution. And sort of that was kind of the trope, in books about diseases. And so I wanted to do something different. And actually my curiosity was different. I was really much more interested in, well, where do these things come from, right? You're in a situation where there is, you're just regular life. There's no pathogen, and suddenly there is a pathogen, right? And to me, that's not where the story begins. That's where the mystery starts of like, where did this thing come from? So what I tried to do in my pandemic book was to look at how does a microbe turn into a pandemic causing pathogen? What is that process? And, I think a lot, one of the themes in a lot of my work has been looking at phenomena that we tend to think of as purely biological and trying to find the political and economic and social aspects to it. And then also looking at things that we think of as purely political and economic and finding the biological aspects to it. So kind of bringing sort of science and politics and history together has always really been my interest. And so when I was looking at how microbes turn into pandemic causing pathogens, they really follow a very well-worn pathway. I looked at, I did my reporting in lots of different places. I went to Haiti to report on the cholera outbreak there. I went to South China where I reported on an outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza and also followed the path of the first SARS coronavirus, SARS-1, that traveled out of South China into Hong Kong and then out of the, into our flight network and went to dozens of countries from there. I went to India. I reported there on highly antibiotic resistant bacterial pathogens. And then I reported from here in the United States because these things were not just happening in far off places. These things were happening right here in the US too. We had new kinds of tick-borne diseases like Lyme disease and many others. We have new kinds of vector-borne diseases, mosquito-borne diseases like West Nile virus, like dengue, which, Florida has had several dengue outbreaks. And all of this is, was happening over the course of the last sort of few decades. Since 1940, we've had over 300 of these new pathogens either emerge kind of out of nowhere or reemerge into new places where they'd never been seen before. So even Ebola, the Ebola outbreak we had in 2014, it was in West Africa. It had never been seen in West Africa before. There had only been outbreaks in Central Africa and other parts of the continent. So it just seemed like pathogens were on the move. And, I tried to kind of figure out why that might be. And again, it's something that we thought of as, oh, this is just, biology, right? Like, this is just like nature. It just happens through like scientific processes. Well, no, it doesn't. A lot of it is about how we are interacting with nature and with the landscape and with each other. So what I did in that book is rather than just look at sort of new pathogens and try to report on, oh, this dengue outbreak, oh, that Ebola outbreak, oh, this SARS outbreak, I did that. And then I also compared those outbreaks and how they were emerging to how a really successful pandemic causing pathogen had done it. And my comparison in that book was to cholera. There's actually only been a handful of pathogens that have been able to cause pandemics. It's kind of rare in a way. Like we've had HIV, of course, influenza, smallpox, and there's a plague, and then cholera. There's really, you can count them on one hand almost. And now, of course, we have COVID-19. But cholera is probably our most successful of the pandemic causing pathogens. If you look at this pantheon of pathogens that can cause pandemics, cholera would really be at the top of that list because it's caused not just 1 or 2 pandemics, but 7 pandemics. And that one is going on right now, not, right in our hemisphere. And so I wanted to look at, how did cholera achieve that amazing kind of supremacy over our kind and over our societies. And the path it took is really the same one that all the other ones are taking too. And that is that these microbes that cause these all this death and disruption for us really almost all emerge out of the environment, the natural environment. About 60% of the new pathogens we've been seeing over current decades since 1940 come from the bodies of animals, about 70% from the bodies of wild animals. And there's a good reason for that. It's not because animals are out to get us or because they are especially infested with pathogenic microbes. Most of these microbes don't even cause disease in those animals. But what happens is we start, using up the landscape, using up the habitat where these wild animals live, whether it's birds or bats or non-human primates or, any number of other species. And that creates new interfaces between people and wildlife. And what that does is it allows the microbes that live harmlessly in their bodies to cross over into ours. And once these microbes come into our bodies, they do what microbes do is they exploit this novel habitat, replicate and adapt and evolve and often turn into pathogens. So cholera did that. It emerged out of the Sundarbans in Bangladesh in the 19th century. And this was because, this is actually a microbe that lives in the water. A lot of people don't know that it lives naturally in the water, especially in salty water, like half salty, half fresh water that's kind of warm. So brackish coastal waters in tropical areas are really great for cholera vibrio, which is the bacteria that causes the disease called cholera. But we have them right here. I live in Baltimore. We have them right here in the Chesapeake Bay too. So cholera bacteria in its normal marine habitat, it doesn't cause disease. It doesn't, it actually helps recycle nutrients. It lives in conjunction with little, planktonic organisms. And actually could play an important ecological role in those environments. But, when we start cutting down wetlands, then people start getting exposed to brackish water. This is what happened in the Sundarbans in the 19th century. And people get exposed to it again and again, exposed to that bacteria, and it starts to adapt to our bodies and turn into a pathogen. That's how cholera first emerged in the 19th century. And then we carried it in the bodies of soldiers and traders and travelers into the cities of the old world. And we took it across the Atlantic on our brand new steamships. We built canals, and that allowed cholera to wash down all of our canals and hit our big port cities like New York, London, Paris. All these cities had huge outbreaks of cholera in the 19th century, and thousands of people died. And we see the same thing happening with other pathogens following in its footsteps. We look at the first SARS. We know it came out of bats. It probably moved from bats into civet cats and then into humans. And that's, again, because humans are deforesting a lot of places where bats live. And that means that, the bats don't just disappear. They actually, if you cut down the trees where the bats live far off from you, they come and live in your backyards and in your gardens and in your farms instead. I don't know if any of you have fruit trees, but I used to live in Australia, and we had a mango tree in our backyard, which was lovely. But the fruit bats would come, during mango season, and what they do is they're attracted to the really ripe fruit, but they don't eat it. They just pierce it and suck out all the juice, and then just let it drop. So the mango tree was just littered with all of this rotten, half-eaten fruit, covered in bat saliva and bat poop. And of course, we had small kids at that time, and like kids anywhere, they went and played near these trees and picked up they would pick up this fruit, and I'm sure it would be very easy for someone, a little kid, to pick up a piece of fruit, a little bat poo or bat saliva on it, and then get it on their hands, and then put their hands in their mouth. And that's all it really needs for a microbe that lives in the bat to cross over into the human body. And that's exactly how the Ebola outbreak began in 2014 in West Africa. It was a single spillover event. And we know this from genetic analyses. of a little boy who was playing near a tree where bats were known to roost. He was the very first case of Ebola in 2014 in West Africa. He got sick and he infected his family members, and they got sick and they infected their healthcare workers and they infected their family, and on and on and on. And then we had the biggest outbreak of Ebola, in history. It was bigger than all previous Ebola outbreaks combined. And so, we see that same thing happening with SARS. So the first SARS did that. The second SARS, what we're living through right now. So a lot of these new diseases are coming out of the environment because of the way we are using up so much wildlife habitat. Our homes, our cities, our towns have paved over half of the terrestrial surface of this planet. So it just leaves very little for other species. And so whatever's left, they kind of have to crowd into these smaller and smaller fragments of habitat that we've left behind for them. And what that means is that where they live is more frequently close to where we live. And when we live close by to each other, right, we have that interface gets more common, more intense, and there's more opportunities for us to have novel, intimate kinds of contact with microbes from their bodies and for them to have contact with microbes from our bodies. So this is a two-way street. They're getting sick from us and we're getting sick from them. And it's really part of a bigger picture of what we're doing to the planet. And I think one of the potential silver linings that might come out of this COVID-19 tragedy that we've experienced is an understanding that these pathogens don't just come out of nowhere. It's not inevitable. This is something that is a function of human activity. And so we can change that. There's a lot of things we can do to prevent pandemics from happening in the first place. And I think one thing that has become so clear to so many people now, which is really fantastic, is that once these things start, it's really hard to get them under control. And it's much, much easier if we can prevent it from happening in the beginning, before you have this massive expansion. You have, these pathogens all over the place in a million different populations and across continents like we do right now. And I think, there's some movement towards that now. I mean, now that we have an administration that actually cares about the environment and is willing to make policy around it, I'm hopeful that we can actually get to a place where, maybe we could make COVID-19 the last pandemic. Wouldn't that be amazing? When I was doing this research for this book on pandemics, of course, this is, I came out in 2016. So it was a speculative question that I would ask all the experts I talked to. I would ask them, well, which pathogens do you think will cause the next pandemic? I mean, all of them agreed a pandemic's coming, a big pandemic's coming. In fact, there had been a survey of epidemiologists, which I cite in the book, in which over half said that and this is, back in 2015 or something, over half said that a pandemic that would sicken 1 billion people, kill 165 million people, and cost the global economy $3 trillion would occur sometime in the next 2 generations. And so that was something I would, I took that on book tour. I put that in my book. And people just thought, oh my God, like that's like science fiction, but of course, lo and behold, here we are. Although of course we're not nearly as bad. We've done a lot worse on the economic part of it than in the death toll, as horrible as the death toll has been. But even though the acute phase of COVID-19 is ending, there's going to be a long, slow tail to this thing, I think. But anyway, to get back to what I was asking the experts, I would ask them, which pathogen do you think is going to cause the next big one, and they would almost always give me one of 2 answers. The first answer was, a pathogen, something like influenza. Something that spreads like influenza, but is just a little bit more deadly, that could cause the next big pandemic. And of course, that's exactly what SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is. It spreads as well as the flu, and it's just a little bit more deadly. And so that's enough, because we're really good at breathing on each other and spreading these respiratory pathogens around. But the second category of answers to that question still worries me, because it's something that we haven't really addressed yet, or at least not adequately yet at all. And I don't think we've fully grappled with what it means. And so the second answer that experts would tell me of the pathogen that could cause the next big pandemic is a highly antibiotic resistant form of bacterial pathogen. So one of these so-called superbugs. And we've had some of those already, and we're just steadily marching closer and closer to that day when we will have a bacterial pathogen that is so resistant to any antibiotic that we really can't control it at all. And we're nearly there already. And this is really traced back entirely to our own behavior, because of the way we've used antibiotics with such sort of reckless abandon. We haven't been good stewards of those medications. And so, the more you use antibiotics, the more bacterial pathogens get exposed to them, and what doesn't kill them makes them stronger and triggers more evolution of resistance, and they get more and more resistant. And that's what we've been doing ever since we developed antibiotics, in the 1940s. And in fact, the scientist who developed antibiotics and, accepted the Nobel Prize for it, in his acceptance speech, he said, we need to use these carefully, because if we use them for commercial reasons, or if we use them for, reasons that are not medically necessary, then they won't work anymore. We will get resistant forms of bacterial pathogens. And, he knew it at the beginning, and we didn't listen. And so here we are, we are really close to having bacterial pathogens that are basically uncontrollable. And what that means is, modern medicine really relies on its ability to tame infection. So if you need a knee replacement surgery, for example, or if you need, any kind of elective surgery, the only reason that it's okay, it's like that the risk is manageable to do an elective surgery, is because your surgeon and your medical team knows that if you were to get an infection, they can control it with antibiotics. Now, if that is no longer true anymore, right? And once we have like highly resistant forms of bacterial pathogens around, that's not true anymore, then all of that comes to a standstill, right? Modern surgery comes to a standstill. A lot of medical interventions come to a standstill. Suddenly, any infection becomes, potentially life-threatening, because you can't necessarily stop it with any medication like we can now for most of our infectious diseases, bacterial diseases. So I think that's like a big open box. Like, I think we haven't really dealt with that. We've been thinking about, we've had this year to understand respiratory viruses and like coronavirus, to understand how they emerge out of wildlife, like bats or other creatures, and how, our own actions can spread them around and all that. And that's been just a huge educational experience for all of us. And I think it's fantastic that we have learned so much, at a terrible cost, but at least we also have learned something. But I don't think we've grappled with that other threat yet, at least not enough. We've made a few tiny baby steps, but even, just as of a few years ago, last time I looked at the data on this, about 80% of the antibiotics that are used in the United States are used for non-medically necessary reasons. That is, they're used in commerce, mostly in agriculture. And, that's a surefire way to hasten us along the path to a future when we have bacterial pathogens that we can't control anymore. So the good news is, now that we have raised our awareness of the burden of pandemic causing pathogens, that we are in a moment where we can actually understand some of these causal, factors and maybe do something about them, because really, pandemics are not inevitable. This is a famous quote from Larry Brilliant, the epidemiologist who helped tame smallpox. And he said, look, infectious diseases, that is part of the human condition. That is part of living on a planet with microbes. I mean, microbes were on this planet first. It's theirs. We're part of it too, and they let us live here too sometimes. So we're never going to get rid of that, and nor would we want to, because most microbes help us, are neutral or are beneficial to us. So we don't want to sterilize the planet of microbes at all. Not that we could. So infectious diseases is part of that, right? Like you're going to have some infectious diseases. You're going to have outbreaks here and there. We're never going to get rid of that. And we don't want to. But pandemics is something else. Pandemics really are optional. Infectious disease outbreaks, those are inevitable, he said, but pandemics are optional. And I think that is really true. And I think that's one thing I hope many more of us have learned through this trial and tribulation of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that book came out in 2016, and I didn't think it would come true so soon. I the whole point of the book was to say, look, we are at risk of a pandemic, and this is why, and these are the things that are happening. We're invading wildlife habitat, where we have lots of slums, we have lots of crowding of animals and people. These all create like amplification opportunities for new pathogens. We're moving things around in our trade network and our flight network really quickly. We don't have the cooperative institutions and the solidarity internationally. We haven't like flexed those muscles enough to really be good at cooperative action, collective action, which is really what you need to stop these things from spreading in the beginning, when you don't have drugs and you don't have vaccines, as we have all seen. So that those are sort of the things I was trying to say in that book. And I didn't think it would come true so soon, but having finished that book in 2015 is when I actually, completed the writing of it. And so I started moving into some new projects. And this was right around the time of the so-called migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. This is when there was because of the Syrian civil war, changes in Libya and elsewhere, there was just lots and lots of people who were moving across the Middle East, across Africa, and trying to get into Western Europe, and sort of coming through this bottleneck of the Mediterranean Sea. And there was just, it was capturing headlines every day of like the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. People were, getting on these rickety boats and trying to get across this sea and to get to Europe, and they were drowning, and little kids were washing up on the beaches of Greece and Lesbos, and borders were closing in Europe to keep them away. And there was all these big refugee camps that were being formed, ad hoc refugee camps that were sort of expanding in different parts of Southern Europe. And so I looked at this phenomenon and I thought, well, and I'd spent, 15 years writing about the problems that happen when people, microbes, animals, all these different things start moving and colliding in new ways. And I thought, well, here we have, these people coming from Syria and Afghanistan, places that are, failed states and they probably didn't have vaccination campaigns going or good public health systems going. They're moving under great duress into places where there's a totally sort of novel disease environment, different people, different foods, different kinds of encounters. And to me, that was like, well, this could be occasion for an outbreak, right? This is the kind of thing that could lead to a public health threat. So I got a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, which is a wonderful organization that has supported my work for many years, to go report on the possibilities of disease outbreaks due to the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. And I remember talking to a doctor in Greece. I visited some of the refugee camps there. I was doing interviews and stuff. And I sat down to talk to a doctor. I think he was from Doctors Without Borders in Athens, Greece. And I don't remember exactly what I said, but I said something along the lines of, well, what are some of the health impacts of this migrant crisis, or, something along those lines. But I use that term, migrant crisis. And he said, there is no migrant crisis. And I sort of, paused and said, well, there's people drowning in the Mediterranean. They're fleeing bombs and beheadings. All these borders in Europe are closing. Brexit was happening. Germany was even closing its borders. The whole free movement in Europe was like falling apart. There's all these massive detention centers and refugee camps. There's so much tumult. And I said, well, what is it then? There's a crisis going on of some kind. And he said, yeah, but it's not a migrant crisis, because there's plenty of jobs for these people. There's plenty of housing for these people. We have absorptive capacity for them. The crisis is being triggered because of the lack of welcome, the lack of reception. So he called it a crisis of welcome. And, that really kind of took my breath away, because I honestly hadn't really considered any of those questions, and I don't think many people had. When we called it a migrant crisis, that was almost reflexive, because we weren't looking at these other questions. We weren't looking at, well, is it better for the people on the move that they move? Is that migration for them? Is it life-saving? Does it contribute to the resilience of the places they left behind? What did they add to the places that they're going to? Is there absorptive capacity in those places? Those are all the questions you'd want to ask and to answer, to know whether a given migration was sort of positive or negative. But I think, and it wasn't just me that jumps to the conclusion that, well, it's people are moving, it's a crisis, it's a catastrophe. It's like the two words go together, migrant crisis. And we don't think about any of those other questions. And so this was another example of something that we thought of as a purely political phenomenon, but actually has a lot of roots in nature and biology too. And I went back to try to kind of interrogate it for myself. Like, why did I do that? Why did I reflexively put together migration and crisis as if it's necessarily a catastrophe, when it's maybe just because of people's choices that we're turning it into a catastrophe? And so that sort of impulse and that process of like that journey I ended up taking is what became my latest book, The Next Great Migration, which looks at how migration, which we think of as catastrophic, is actually part of our deep history. It's how we have survived on a changing planet from the very beginning, and not just us, but so many other wild species also. We have right now 80% of wild species are moving into new places in sync with the changing climate. And they're doing that to save their own lives. They're doing that to survive. They're moving north, they're moving up into the mountains. And, while we know that that's going to cause some disruptions and that's going to be difficult in some places, what wildlife biologists and conservationists also know is that we need those migrations to happen to preserve biodiversity in the future. And the same is actually true with people. People are moving into new places right now, and we need them to move, because that's what's going to keep our societies resilient too. I don't think we think of it that way at all. We still think of migration sort of instantly as a problem, sort of reflexively as a problem. But I think if you really, and what I tried to do in this book is really interrogate why that is, and what really has been the role of migration in our own past and in our history and in nature more generally. And I look at some of the new science and what it's telling us, you look at things like paleogenetics. We have this sense that, well, we migrated once a long time ago, we walked out of Africa, and then we kind of just stayed still for millennia until this modern era of migration. Well, no, that's not what paleogenetics is telling us. Paleogenetics is telling us, actually, in ancient times, humans kept going. We walked out of Africa into the Americas, and we walked back into Europe and back into Asia and back to Africa and all which ways in these very complex migratory patterns that are really just as intricate as our modern migration routes are. And we went into places that were very hard to go to. We paddled off from the coast of Asia out into the expansive Pacific Ocean with no features at all, no navigational clues at all, in canoes in ancient times, not just once, not just twice, multiple times. We had to have done that to settle Polynesia, and we did that a long time ago. That's what the genetics is telling us now, as well as the archaeology and the linguistics. We walked out of Asia into the heights of the Tibetan Plateau in the Himalayan mountains. These are places where there's not even enough oxygen to breathe. And we did that not because we had run out of food in any of those other places we were already living, not because some tragedy had happened, some catastrophic event had happened. We did it to migrate just because we did. So that really begs the question of what is migration about, right? Is this something that we want to continue to think of as a problem? Or as we're entering this era of rapid change, where we have rising seas, we have heavier storms, we have settlement patterns that are based on a climate that no longer exists, do we want to say, no, everyone stay still, migration is a problem? Or do we want to say, let's start building some bridges because we need people to move to new places. We need wild species to move to new places because this is how we're actually going to survive. And so that's kind of the overall argument of the book, is that migration is not a crisis. It's actually just the opposite. It's really part of the solution. So thank you for listening to me drone on. And I think I've talked for a while now. So let's do some questions.
So much, Sonia. We do have some questions that have come in through Facebook. I would like to start with one of the most fascinating subjects that I think you confront in the next Great Migration, which is this separation between so-called invasive species and native species. That's a huge distinction that I think a lot of well-meaning environmentalists make, and it's become kind of gospel here in South Florida that species like the lionfish and the iguana and the Burmese python are fundamentally harmful and should be eradicated. What is your counter argument from your research in this debate about invasive species?
Yeah, so there's no denying that some species in certain environments cause huge amounts of damage ecologically or to crops or to already resident species. And so, I don't at all deny that. That is definitely happening. At the same time, when we lump together all species that are non-native as if they are also, just based on where they're from, that means that they are alien and invasive, that's an error in the way we're thinking about it, because that's not what the science shows. So what the science shows is that for all the species that go into new places, only 10% of them are able to establish themselves in those new places, right? So 90% of the time when a species comes into a new habitat, they're going to fail. They're not going to be able to stay there for whatever reason. So only 10% can actually make it. Of those 10% that make it into a new habitat, only 10% become pest-like, that is, cause any of the array of qualities that we find problematic. Now, some of those are ecological. Some of those are just things we don't like because, this creature came into this new place and now it's eating my garden, my nice garden plants or my crop that I want to grow for my business. I mean, those are completely legitimate concerns. I'm not saying they're not, but we're talking about all of those issues, right? Like causing a disease, causing just, pesty stuff. Only 10% of the 10% can actually do those things. So that qualify as calling them invasive. So we're talking about 1% of all non-native species that actually become invasive. So what I'm saying is invasiveness is a problem, but it's not a problem of non-native species. It's not a problem of species moving into new places. It's something that even native species can sometimes have, can actually cause invasive effects. And we also see a lot of non-native species being really important to our ecosystem and really valued. You think about honeybees or earthworms, for example. There's many species that are kind of the state emblems in different states that actually are introduced species. So it's sort of the same way of thinking about crime and immigration, where we had, in the previous administration, there was sort of this conflation of immigrants and crime, right? Immigrants cause crime. If you have more immigrants, you have more crime. Well, that's true. It's not to say that immigrants never cause crime. Some of them do. But it is to say that crime is not a problem of immigration. And we can make that same distinction, I think, with introduced species. Just because something is not native to a place doesn't mean that it's definitely invasive, right? Invasiveness is not something that it draws from a species origin. And especially right now, when we have all these species moving into new places, that we need them to move, right? We need them to move into new places to survive climate change, because all their habitats are being so transformed. So we want species to come into new places. So I think we need to just start thinking about it differently. I mean, I know in Florida, there's really particular problems with released pets and things like that. And in fragile ecosystems, in island ecosystems, sometimes adding a certain, just one specific species can really make a huge difference. And that is a totally legitimate problem that we need to manage. But that doesn't mean we should say no species should move ever. And that's kind of where conservation has sometimes tended towards, that we should get rid of introduced and non-native species even before they cause any damage. That has become a principle in some circles. It's been enshrined in international conventions on biological diversity and things like that. But even among the experts who study invasion biology will say now, look, things can become invasive, but it's much more about like how we have altered the ecological conditions and the peculiar mix of species that are there, because it's, many species are moving into new places. Most of them are causing no problem at all. So we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, in other words.
Question is regarding pandemics that has come in from Cindy on Facebook, who says, can we in America prevent future pandemics by continuing to wear masks after COVID, much like certain populations of Asian countries? I've heard that common colds have decreased since mask wearing was recommended. I think that might be a hard sell in the United States, but what do you think, Sonia?
Yeah, I think, mask wearing can definitely reduce the spread of respiratory pathogens. And so, yeah, you're right. We haven't had a flu season at all. But, we're doing a lot more than just wearing masks. A lot of us are staying in, and we don't have school in a lot of places. So there's a lot of other changes that probably contribute to that, changes that we would not want to continue for very much longer. But the problem is not every new pathogen, not every new pandemic causing pathogen is going to be a respiratory pathogen. Some of these pathogens spread in different ways. Even SARS-CoV-2 might also spread through other means. Like we know it comes out in the sewage, for example, right? So there could be other modes of transmission. So just wearing masks is not going to mean that, we're going to be protected from the next pandemic, because it could come at us in a totally different way. At the same time, the more we do reduce opportunities for respiratory pathogens to spread between us, we're going to be healthier in a lot of different ways, because there's not, as the questioner said, it's not just COVID, it's also influenza, it's also colds. It was interesting at the beginning of this pandemic when there was this sense in our rhetoric that, maybe this is just like a flu. This is just a flu, like just a flu. Flu is a serious disease that kills many hundreds of millions of people every year. It costs the economy huge amounts of money. We lose, it's a constant drain. And that is despite having generations of immunity built up to it and a huge R&D program that produces a flu shot every year, which millions and millions and millions of us have to take, right? So even with all of that effort to tame flu, we still pay this huge price in blood and treasure to influenza every year. So to say that just a flu, like that was like crazy to me. flu is really serious. We don't want to have another flu. And I think unfortunately that's what COVID-19 might become, is, adding to our seasonal burden of respiratory pathogens. So yeah, mask wearing can help. And I think there will be more cultural openness to that among certain parts of the population, and any little bit we do will help. But unfortunately, pathogens are pretty wily, and the next one may not be a respiratory pathogen.
A few questions came in from Celia on Facebook. She says, I am perplexed by the mess in Syria, where the dictator is allowed to murder his own people, causing them to want to migrate. Why must the rest of the world just look on? Good questions. Should our administrations, for instance, have done more about the crisis in Syria?
I mean, that's really outside the scope of my particular area of work, but absolutely. I mean, I think that we all had a responsibility that we failed to help the people of Syria maintain peace in that country. And the spillover effects are just so huge. And it's not just, all those people had to leave. I mean, their lives have been shattered, and most of them didn't even make it out. Right. So really, the migration is sort of the best part of what happened out of that horrible tragedy. What's really much worse is when people get trapped inside of those broken societies and violent societies. That's what's happened in Syria. It's happening in places where we have, continuing violence, continuing, massive storms. I was in Bahamas after Dorian, and, the biggest problem there was that people were stuck. They couldn't get off the island. Because there's no legal pathways to move for, just because the sea level is rising. We don't have any legal pathways to do that. So there's a lot of gaps that contribute to people needing to move. But I do think that when people move, that shouldn't be the thing that tells us, something's wrong. In most cases, we can absorb a lot of the movement that happens if we have the political will to do it. And, we can manage it, right? Like, it's not to say that there's no disruptions. There's definitely disruptions when people are moving around. But these are things that we can minimize the negative impacts, and we can maximize the positive ones, just like we do with every other part of human experience that is difficult, but that we know, in the end, the benefits outweigh the costs.
So one contagion that you have a personal relationship's a bad word with, but that's MRSA or MRSA. Wendy would like to know how your sons are contending with this.
Thank you for asking. The thing that was so amazing is we struggled for years. I got it to, both my sons got it. My husband didn't get it. So that was unusual also. I mean, it just goes to show like how little we really understand about pathogens and immunity and what's really happening. It's so complex and multi-layered. Ultimately, and I track this in the book to some extent, what happened is we kept treating it, and then nothing was working. And so we kind of just stopped, and we would have the lesions and we wouldn't do anything. We would just kind of ignore them. And at least for me, they started to just go away. And my son, I don't think, has had an outbreak for a few years now. So I don't know if we're done with it, or if it's just like in our body, it's going to come back out when our immune systems are weak, or something like that. Seems like a plausible scenario, but at least for now, we seem to be MRSA free, which is wonderful.
On Facebook has a question. She says, super interesting topic, and I love your optimistic outlook. You mentioned that we have gained a new awareness in 2020, which I totally agree with. And in your opinion, what is the best thing that we can do today as a society moving forward with this new awareness?
That's such a great question. I think what we really, really need to do is to find the political will to really arrest biodiversity loss, that we are losing 150 species of this planet every day. It is a huge crisis. It is the biggest crisis. And it's because of habitat destruction. It's because we are expanding and destroying so much wildlife habitat. That's why we're losing species every day. It's not because of climate change. It's not because of disease and storms. It's because we are using up their homes. We are destroying their homes. And what we know about pandemics is that if you have a lot of diverse species around, these spillovers are much less likely to happen. And when they do happen, they're less likely to cause disease. There's a dilution effect, instead of a bat microbe coming into a civet, into a human, the bat microbe just goes into some other creature that is resistant to it, or it's much less likely. So when we reduce biodiversity, we make these chains of transmission more likely. And so there's some great new initiatives that are just starting up now from environmental groups and also from public health groups to really get at preventing pandemics at their source. And by doing, and there's a new effort I've just recently heard of trying to protect 30% of the planet, right? So let's leave 30% of the mountains, the forests, the wetlands. Let's leave 30% of that for other species, not just us. I mean, it seems like, considering we are just one species among millions, like the fact that we get 70% still seems a little bit unfair to me. But, even leaving 30% for wildlife, I think is going to be a hard sell. But if there's ever a moment when we have momentum to do that, it would be right now, I think.
I am told we have time for one more question. Thanks to everyone who typed in questions. We actually have more than we'll be able to get to. Someone just wrote in on YouTube, do you think that our immune systems will suffer in the long run because by wearing masks, we won't be exposed to other common and not so common antigens?
That's a great question. I mean, I do think that there's good evidence that our immune systems do need to be exposed to microbes and even pathogenic microbes in order to function properly. That's how they evolved. And so that's how they function best. But unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, I don't think masks really protect us from all of the pathogens or all of the microbes in any way. I mean, I think we're getting plenty of exposures through, our dirty hands and our environments and our foods and our pets and our livestock and, all the other places that we encounter the microbe-rich world around us. So, the masks help us with droplets from other people. But we're still breathing in tons of stuff, and we're still eating things and touching things. And, we live in a microbial soup, and that I think will continue. And we want that to continue. So, but you're right. Like I think the more sterile our environments become, that actually can contribute to a loss of immunity. And that's been linked to allergies and asthma and things like that. So yeah, we want to be, we want to be connected to microbes, the world of microbes and the world of animals. And, we want to be part of the fabric of nature. We don't want to take ourselves out of it. And I think, even when nature can be scary, like during a pandemic, I think we can see the value in being connected.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for this enlightening discussion. And at this point, I will take it back to Cynthia.
Thank you, John. That was excellent. And Sonia, you were amazing. And I would urge people to read both of your books. They are just full of little nuggets of information that you can't forget, that kind of open your eyes to a lot of different things. So I hope this inspires people to go read. And I think it was very interesting. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.